Is it time? Hmm? You are in the spotlight. And, see, I don't dare turn around and look at that thing. I can't. I look at that thing and I get a migraine. All right. Looks like we're about to start here. Mike, would you lead us in prayer? Well, it's good to be back. I had some minor surgery last week, and I had forgotten the definition of minor surgery when I went in there. See, minor surgery is yours. Major surgery is mine. What I did not expect was the immense head-splitting pain that would followed it. I had about 20 gremlins trying to beat their way out of my head with a 9-pound sledgehammer and a splitting maul. And here sits Terry over here, who I owe big. I called up Terry and I said, "Can you help me?" He said, "Yeah, I'd be glad to." Now that was Saturday morning. What Terry didn't tell me was that they had to leave town and go to a funeral. So the lesson you got last week, Terry built by burning the midnight oil. And I appreciate you, my friend. I appreciate you very much. And let me tell you, folks that do things like that are good folks. And okay, we had started, well, we actually didn't start, Daniel. We just kind of laid the groundwork for it a couple of weeks ago. There's a couple of things I want to go back and review because I hurried through them and I wish I hadn't. Okay, if you look at your handouts, I want to talk a little bit about this Iron Age rezoning again and the difference in the Assyrian exile and the Babylonian exile. Now, the thing to see here is look at God's plan coming together. Now, God had warned the prophets. He said, "I'm taking Israel out, but I am going to leave a remnant, and we are going to rebuild from that." Now, the Assyrian exile, that's when they took out the northern kingdom, and they literally packed up all these folks and they hauled them off. They left just a few people in the northern kingdom in what was to be known as Samaria. And they scattered the Israelites all through the Assyrian Empire. And that covers a whole lot of real estate. They scattered them all over the place. And some of them were enslaved, not all of them. The problem with taking too many slaves is you bust the economy. Slaves are just like any other commodity. You get too many of them out there on the street, you bust the economy, they're not worth anything anymore. So these ancient marauders, they seriously had to worry about that. So don't take too many slaves, it'll get us in trouble. We won't make any money. So as a result, not all of them were enslaved. But those few remaining in Samaria intermarried with the people that the Assyrians moved in, and they became known as Samaritans. And of course, you know that the Jews looked down on these folks in later generations. Now the result, if you look on your handout, the Israelites in the northern kingdom, they lost their identity, they lost their culture, they lost their God. And they are known to the historians as the lost tribes of Israel. The thing is about God is that by this time you would be hard put to find an Israelite that didn't have a couple of idols in his pocket. They carry these things around with them. And if things got bad or they needed to consult somebody, they'd pull one of these things out and pray to it. Now they still worship the God that Moses brought them, or some of them did. But the thing was, they were covering all the bases. Said, well, yeah, okay, we talked to this God here. Now we got to check with him, and we got to cover the base over here with this one too. So this is what got them hauled off to parts unknown. So anyway, once you get removed from the region that God owns, that God can't hear you anymore, can't see you anymore. We talked a little about that. So then you pitch that idol and you pick up another one. And so that's the way it worked. That is one of the main reasons the Assyrians relocated them. As long as they got a God to hold them all together, they're trouble. But you separate them out, assimilate them into some other culture, and they've got nothing left. They're demoralized. Now look at the contrast with the Babylonian exile. Almost 100 years later, it happened in 3 major increments. The first being in 605 BC. And when they did this, they took only the best. They took the nobles. They took the royalty. And they took the folks that had the education because they knew they could use them. Now, the educated, the artisans, the craftsmen, all these folks like this, they took them first. And they left the common laborers and the poor and the old folks behind. They didn't need them. Now, when the Israelites arrived in Babylon, they were not enslaved. Actually, they were settled together in their own communities, which they themselves named. They gave them names like New Shiloh or New Bethlehem, whatever. And they continued to practice their given trades. They continued to educate their children. And they established trade with their neighbors. So they're just a big happy community, so to speak, except they're not anywhere near home. They were integrated, but not assimilated like the Israelites from the northern kingdom were. So they kept their identity, and they kept their culture, and they kept their God. Now, when they got hauled off, what did they do with all those items in their pockets? The road was littered with them, because they weren't any good to them anymore, unless you want to melt them down. Okay. I got turned off. What happened? Well, hello. Oh, okay. Yeah. Well, that's good because this thing says no on it, and when it says no, you don't touch it. Let's get some new batteries.
I thought these were good ones.
Okay, we got it back. Okay, now you can hear me again. Well, you're going to regret that. Okay, I think we're back in business. So anyway, the other thing about this, they kept their identity and they were all together. So actually, it strengthened them in the long run. The other thing was what happened to the land of Judah. When the northern kingdom was cleaned out, the Assyrians brought in other people to live there. So it was never vacant. But for some reason, unbeknown to anybody, when Nebuchadnezzar took the last of the Israelites out of Judah, he left it vacant. Fields were fallow, the houses empty, the cities deserted, ghost towns. Now, why do you think Judah was left vacant?
So nobody could prosper from there.
Say again?
So no one could prosper from there.
There's one reason, but there's another reason I'm looking for. The big one. That's right. They knew from the start, because the prophets told them, the exile would be 70 years. 70 years you're going to come back home. Well, they needed a home to come back to. So Nebuchadnezzar, whatever his thinking was, however he was influenced, he left Judah vacant. And again, this is God's plan. Nobody would have left that land standing there empty like that without a reason. And the reason was they were going to come back. It waited like an empty house waiting for its owner to show up. It's really cool when you look at it. You see God's plan. Well, having said all that, let's look at chapter 1. We're finally there. Starts out, it says, in the 3rd year of the reign of Jehoiakim, king of Judah, Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, came to Jerusalem and besieged it. By the way, this was year 605 BC. And the Lord delivered Jehoiakim, king of Judah, into his hand, along with some of the articles from the temple of God. And these he carried off to the temple of his God in Babylonia and put in the treasure house of his God. Now, this is as far as Daniel's description goes as to how he got there. And it's a little weird, and you got to look at it a couple of times before you understand what's really going on here. But what you got to remember is Daniel is not telling us how the entire nation of Israel was placed into exile. He is only telling us about his exile. He went with that first group in 605 BC. He went with those articles of the temple. But what happened to Jehoiakim? It says the 3rd year of his reign, he reigned a total of 11 years. Nebuchadnezzar left him on the throne. He said, you straighten up and fly right, you can stay here. Okay. Well, it didn't exactly work out that way, did it? 3 bad kings, 3 deportations. Here comes Jehoiakim in 597 BC. He'd been playing around with his divided loyalties. One day he's working for Babylon, the next day he's working for Egypt. And Nebuchadnezzar showed up and he says, okay, this is over. So he killed him. So he replaced him with his son Jehoiachin, and he deported about 10,000 people plus to Babylon. Again, he took the best. He let the common laborers in Israel, or in Judah. Now, Ezekiel was probably in this deportation here. Now, 3 months and 10 days later, he shows up again. And this time, he unseats Jehoiachin. We don't know really what was going on there. It doesn't say, but for whatever the reason, he said, nah, I don't think I'm going to do that. So he took Jehoiachin and a good part of the royal family and some more nobles and took them along with this other group. 10,000 people. Ezekiel gave us a more definite count of 10,832. Whatever it was a big bunch of people. Then in 586 BC, Nebuchadnezzar returned again to discuss Zedekiah's divided loyalties. The man had been stirring up rebellion. So Zedekiah is waiting for Pharaoh to show him up and save him. And he didn't get Pharaoh. He got Sam the Sham instead. And here he is on his way to Babylon, minus a couple of eyes. You remember I told that story? And I told you it was probably apocryphal. The reason it's probably apocryphal, if you look at what we just said, Ezekiel and can't remember the other prophet. They were both gone by the time this happened, so they'd already been deported. Okay, now we're finally through with all this, and we're going into verse 3 and 4. Verse 3, some time has passed. Now, Nebuchadnezzar's first siege of Jerusalem ended in September of 605 BC. Daniel was among the first to be exiled, and the trip to Babylon was just short of 1,000 miles. If you look at the maps I gave you a couple of weeks ago, it's a rather circuitous route that they took. They went up north and came back down to Babylon. The reason they didn't go straight across, there's a great big desert there that is full to this day of nothing but oil wells and Bedouins running around there. You didn't take 10,000 people through there, or you'd kill them all. They didn't want their people killed because they were valuable to them. So Because when you look at the series of events leading up to it, verse 3 probably began sometime in 604 BC, but it couldn't have been much later. Now the king orders Ashpenaz, chief of his court officials by the NIV, to bring in some of the Israelites from the royal family and nobility. And he's got certain qualifications he's looking for. Young, I'm sorry guys, but none of us in this room are going to qualify. Without physical defect, ditto. Handsome, ditto. Smart, remains to be seen. Well informed, according to our wives, we are not. Quick to understand, according to our wives, we are definitely not. And qualified to serve in the king's palace. That's the list of qualifications he's looking for. He wants the cream of the crop. And these guys that they chose today would be the folks who get 4-year scholarships at Ivy League schools. The absolute best of the best. Now, let's get this out of the way. I have heard folks get downright emotional about this argument, which is pointless because it is not an issue that has any effect on the outcome of the book. But the question was Daniel a eunuch? All right, I'm going to give you some stuff here and you can figure it out. Ashpenaz is called the prince of the eunuchs in the King James Version. That means that Ashpenaz himself was a eunuch. Furthermore, Josephus specifically states that Ashpenaz was a eunuch. Now, if you worked in the court of an ancient Middle Eastern king, you were a eunuch. Josephus gives us a little bit of leeway when he says that some of those that the king selected for his service were to be eunuchs. There were a lot of government officials. So there were those who worked out in the kingdom all over the place, and there were those who worked in the court. But the ones in the court, they were eunuchs. Now, the question is, why did they do this? It is all about control. Now, there are 2 major sources of conflict in any king's court. The first is sex, and the second one is money. You put the 2 of them together, and you get something called power. That's what everybody's running for. Now, if you make your servants in the court eunuchs, you have deleted and totally eradicated half the problem. It's gone. So that's why they did this stuff. The problem is gone if you do that. Now, the Europeans who came along later, they would never figure this out. And if you are a student of European history or Western civilization in general, if you wanted to know what was going on in Europe from about the year 600 all the way up to the 1800s, you had to know who was sleeping with who. That's one of the things you have to know. You didn't have to worry about this in the Middle East. It's not an issue. One last thing, Isaiah prophesied to Hezekiah in 2 Kings 16 and 18 that his treasure would be carried to Babylon and that his descendants would be among the eunuchs serving in the palace of the king of Babylon. Well, guess what happened? Now, that's the gospel according to Buck, because nowhere does it say that Daniel was a eunuch. It does not say that. But I tell you, given the evidence, he most certainly was. Now, that behind us. It is. It's a moot point. It is totally moot. Like I said, it has no outcome. It has no effect on the outcome of the book. But I have seen folks just get really emotional in their arguments about this. Now, verse 4 says that Ashpenaz was assigned the task of teaching his charges the language and literature of Babylon, both Akkadian and Aramaic, and probably a little Sumerian thrown in there too. He was also charged with teaching them the literature. Now, our boys here, 4 of them we're going to be talking about, they were probably already pretty good and pretty fluent in Aramaic because it was a common language throughout the area. Akkadian, maybe not so much. So they had a lot of learning to do still yet. Now, the literature, learning that means that they were to learn Babylonian culture and religion. The object was to convert them to Babylonians in body and in spirit. But the interesting thing here is, as we shall see momentarily, the Babylonians, at least at this time, were apparently quite tolerant of the religions of those coming in. at least among the Jews. So in verse 5, he's also charged to serve them wine and food from the king's table, meaning the same food that is served to the king. Now, they're not going to eat with the king. It's just the same food that is served on his table. Now, one of the last item here is that they're going into a 3-year training program. And after that, they were to enter the king's service. Now, you can do a lot in 3 years. A lot of school in 3 years. 3 years, get you an MD, doctor. Get you JD, lawyer. Get you a PhD, egghead. So on down the line. But you got to have that education, and you got to have educated people to start with. Now, when you talk about JDs and MDs and all that, you may ask, well, what about the undergrad degree you have to start with? The thing is, these boys have already got it. They got that before they ever left Israel. Now they're going to be learning to do things the way the Babylonians did. Now, verse 6 and 7, Daniel identifies himself in the third person as one of these young men. The total number of the men that were chosen is unknown, and the group probably contained others not only from Judah, but from other lands as well. Daniel and the others, according to Josephus, were all members of the family of Zedekiah. So these 3 fellows that he's fallen in with, they're cousins. They probably rode skateboards together in Jerusalem at one time or another. Now the 4, we have Daniel, who was renamed Belteshazzar, Hananiah, renamed Shadrach, Mishael, renamed Meshach, Azariah, renamed Abednego. Why change their names? He reminds everyone who they're working for. That's the first thing. It also reminds them they're not Israelites anymore, and they are Babylonians. So what do the names mean? You see it there on your handout. Daniel, God is my judge. Change to Belteshazzar. Bel, protect his life. Bel is another name for Marduk, which we learned earlier was the major god of the Babylonians. The Bel sounds a little like something else. Baal, right? Out of the Canaanite god. So there's some similarity and definitely some relation. Hananiah, his name meant the Lord shows grace, changed to Shadrach, command of Aku, a Sumerian moon god. That was Hananiah. Okay. I'm looking a little cross-eyed. Pardon me if that's the effects of last week. Okay, Mishael. I gave you Hananiah's name. Mishael was who is what God is. Meshach is who is what Aku is. Now, this name I found to be rather puzzling because I don't know if it means that Ashpenaz was either very creative or he was not creative at all. It's a question, but it's an interesting name to start with, and then after he changed it, it just adds to the confusion. Azariah, the Lord helps, changed to Abednego, servant of Nego, which is also known as Nebu, another name for Marduk. Now, you've seen the Nebu before, although you may have not noticed it, in the name Nebuchadnezzar. Now, both the Hebrews and the Babylonians incorporated the names of their gods into their given names. It was a very common custom. Now, we're into verse 8. Daniel requests permission from the chief, that is Ashpenaz. He says, I don't want to defile myself by eating the king's food. What's the problem? Food wasn't kosher. If he ate the food, he would be defiling himself because it's unclean. It wasn't merely blessed as we are accustomed to saying a little prayer over what we eat, but sacrificed to the idols. A portion of it was taken off the table and sacrificed. So that had a problem with that. Now, Paul addresses this in 1 Corinthians chapter 8, and he says, this really means nothing. But considering that so many of our converts were former pagans and former Jews, all of them were, and they felt that they were still worshiping idols when they ate this meat, it was better to abstain as opposed to causing those folks to stumble. But this was a different situation. There were no new converts to worry about. Daniel's situation, he was also not a Christian, enjoying the new freedom of being a Christian that Paul talks about. He was a Jew, and he was not going to risk violating the law of Moses by eating this unclean food. Now, there's another problem which Daniel may or may not have been aware, and that is the negative effects of eating food to which you're not accustomed. Changing your diet for any reason can cause a number of problems, including weight gain or loss. We don't mind the loss, do we? Digestive problems and a number of medical conditions. The prescribed diet of the Hebrews was not just a spiritual matter. It was designed to keep them healthy. Now, I had a young soldier one time that I will never forget this kid. His name was Private Eagle. And he was a trainee, so I only had him for about 6 weeks. This kid was an Orthodox Jew. And he liked the Army, but he hated the mess hall. You know why? The mess hall served pork 3 meals a day. He said, I can't eat that stuff. Now, usually there was an alternative choice of chicken or something like that. But he told me that one day, he was new to all this. He's fresh out of high school. He goes, yeah, I'll have some of that. They put it on the plate. He didn't realize it was pork until about the time he'd finished it. He said it made him sick. Made him sick for about 2 days. Because it's just something he was not accustomed to. Now, eventually you would adjust to this, but it takes a while. Now, in verse 9 and 10, the official, that is Ashpenaz again, he had a lot of favor and sympathy for Daniel, and there's 2 reasons for this. One is that Daniel is very diplomatic, and he's a likable guy. The other is that the Lord provided that. He helped him with that. But this time Ashpenaz said, I can't do this. He said, I can't have you looking bad from not eating properly. The king will have my head. Now, we know that Nebuchadnezzar's pretty loose with the axe. So he had a good point there. Well, verses 11, 13, Daniel brings his 3 compatriots into it, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. And he makes an offer, not to the official, but to the guard, which, by the way, Josephus identifies as a fellow named Arioch, and we will see him again later. Now, he says, give us nothing but vegetables and water for 10 days, and compare us to the others, and treat us in accordance with what you see. Well, the guard apparently did not know much about the previous conversation, so he said, yeah, I'll do that for you. Now, look at how Daniel handled the situation. His approach to this reflects his education. Along with Moses and Solomon, he's the most educated man probably in the entire Old Testament. He's a noble. He's already been trained as a teenager to be a diplomat. That was his career path, apparently. Now, what if he had just flat out refused? What do you think the result would have been? He'd have been dead. We see it on the news every day. There's somebody who has no power whatsoever that stands up and says, I'm just not going to do that. What happens to them? Every time they get their heads handed back to them. You don't do this. But Daniel, he was a diplomat. A lot of diplomacy in the Bible. This was a good one, and my other favorite is David and Saul. David could have walked out into the main street in Israel and said, all right, everybody get together here. I've been anointed king. He's still there. We're going to get rid of him. He could have started a civil war and killed thousands of people. But he chose instead to take a few people he trusted and take to the desert and go on the lam and wait it out for the Lord to do what needed to be done. And it happened that way. Diplomacy. Now, back to their story. Verses 15 and 16. 10 days passed, and our kids look better than anybody else. Don't look for a miracle here. There was none. I mean, consider the options here. 10 days of Big Macs and alcohol versus 10 days of raw vegetable and water. What is the difference? Who's going to come out of this healthier? There's just no comparison. So the guard took away the good food, replaced it with the vegetables for everybody. I bet these guys are really popular. Now, you have vegetarians and vegans. Vegetarians eat no meat. Vegans eat no meat and no animal byproducts, to include dairy. Now, the problem with being a vegan is that these guys walk around taking handfuls of vitamins every day because they're not getting what their body needs from the meat and those animal products. So Daniel and his buddies here are on a vegan diet, and now everybody is on one. Now, our bodies are not designed to live like that indefinitely. So, Gospel according to Buck again. I don't think this was a permanent thing. I think that somewhere down the line, somebody looked around and understood what they were getting at and started bringing in kosher food. That's all I got to say about that. It's really not important. Verse 17, the Lord gave them understanding of everything to which they were exposed. Everything these boys touched turned to gold. Now, most of us are good at some things, but definitely not everything. I'm good at language, I'm good at history, good at the arts, I can play some instruments, have a good time. But the funny thing happens. When I put 2 and 2 together, sometimes it's 4, sometimes it's 9, sometimes it's 76. Now that means one of two things. If somebody can do that with 2 and 2, he's either a really good accountant or he is a terrible mathematician. I'm not an accountant, so that only leaves one idea. So, okay, don't give me numbers. It doesn't work. So, but unlike us, we've all got something we're not good at. These boys were good at absolutely everything. In particular, Daniel was given the gift from God to interpret visions and dreams. Now, there seems to be a lot of concern about dreams among Babylonians, and we'll see more about this in chapter 2. But we're moving on to verses 18 through 20. Finally, our boys are presented to the king. Sounds like a meet and greet, as we call them in the army, and I hated those things. And he found none equal to these 4 young men. So they entered into the king's service. Now, if the court had been a car lot, there'd have been 4 Cadillacs in that lot. They were that good. Heavy on wisdom and understanding. The king found them to be 10 times better than all the magicians and enchanters in the kingdom. Now, that's a subjective statement. Don't take that literally. But what he's really saying is none of his current staff could compete with them in the smarts department. They were very intelligent. They were still young, however, and inexperienced. But he were handpicked by the king, and he was preparing them for bigger and better things.
I don't think God got them to be that smart. I mean, he might not gave them the divine power to be that smart. But don't you think he had a major hand in that somehow?
These boys have been cruising along all the way through this story with divine assistance. All the way through. All the way through. Now, matter of fact, that was the next point. The overriding theme throughout the book of Daniel is that God prevails and controls everything. And we have seen this so far. Everything from what has happened to the Israelites in general to what has happened to these 4 gentlemen here. Verse 21 finishes up there and it says, and Daniel remained there, that meaning in the king's court, until the first year of King Cyrus. Now the question is, what does that mean? Well, Cyrus the Great was not a Babylonian, he was a Persian. And Babylon fell to the Persian and the Medo-Persian Empire in 538 or 539 BC. Now, don't get hung up on the first year of Cyrus. That's what I'm trying to say here, is that because once Cyrus came in the door, Daniel continued to serve him. But that was as far as the Babylonians kept the records, so they said that was the end. Now, we got some time. We're going to get into chapter 2. Any questions on chapter 1? I appreciate your input, but questions are scary. Yes, Dan?
Well, it's pretty unusual for a king's court to be carried over into the court of the next king. Is this just comfort of the nation?
Kind of like a yes and no on that. If you look at more recent examples, Nazi Germany. When the Allies took over Germany, They looked at all these guys and they said, okay, you were the postmaster, right? Yes, I was. He says, okay, you're going to continue to be the postmaster, but you can't say Heil Hitler anymore. Was the old guy a Nazi? Yes, he was. You ran the railroad, right? Yes. You can still run the railroad, but you can't be a Nazi anymore. So, and they had a meeting with some German generals about 20 years after the war, and they were discussing dealing with the Soviets. And they had a map laid out there, all this good stuff, and one of the generals, he was talking about something going on. They said, well, what about this in the north? He said, I'm sorry, I can't reach that high anymore. So, anyway, these people were still Nazis. By the way, that was a huge mistake we made in Iraq, because in Iraq, they went in there and said, you were the post office? Yeah. Well, you're out of a job. Get out of here. And they created the insurgent movement by that very action. That's what happened. If they'd have let those people in their jobs and said, you can still do your job, but the Ba'ath Party is gone, they'd have probably had a very different result in Iraq. Need to say. Anyway, chapter 2 begins in the second year of Nebuchadnezzar's reign, which would have been between April 603 to March 602 BC. That is, remember, we're counting backwards on the years. And, okay, it's 603 BC, but nobody knows it's 603 BC. So they have to measure their time from specific events. Second year of Nebuchadnezzar's reign. Okay, yeah. Okay, he came along at 605, so, okay, 603, or maybe as late as 602, because he became king right around September of 605. Now, note that Daniel entered into his 3-year training period in about 604 BC. So chapter 2 apparently takes place about the time or not long before Daniel's graduation from his training. He is a third-year grad student, and he is enjoying himself, I'm sure.
At this point, how old would Daniel be?
He's probably about 22 years old, somewhere in there. We don't know for sure. So he's still a very young guy. Now, here we find Nebuchadnezzar suffering from insomnia. He is having dreams, that's dreams with an S, and his mind is troubled. Very, very troubled. Now let's talk about dreams a minute. Dreams take place during REM sleep, rapid eye movement. That period of your sleep, your eyes are moving around constantly, like you're watching something, and you're watching your dreams. Dreams are the mind's method of sorting out and organizing the events of recent and old memories. Now, if your old memories get scrambled up, the older you get, right? You can blame your dreams for some of that because your old memories come back to you and they add things and subtract things. And the next thing you know, oh, that didn't happen like that. It happened like this over here. That's part of it. Now, while sometimes dreams appear to be a jumbled up pile of the prior day's events, they can also remind us of things we need to be doing or some things we need to be doing to get our lives in order. Sometimes they tell us things we need to know. And sometimes they tell us things we have no business knowing. We're not going there today. Nebuchadnezzar, along with many, if not most folks who lived at that time, understood this, and he made it an important factor in his life. Now, dreams are highly symbolic. Nebuchadnezzar also understood this, and that is why this situation worried him so much. Dreams are believed by some to foretell the future, and it's true, they do. They really do. Now, you think about this. All day long, you're making decisions. Should I go left, go right? Should I eat breakfast now, or should I eat it later? What are we going to do for lunch? I need to go down to the courthouse today. What do you do? You're making these decisions constantly. And these decisions all have consequences. There are also other people making decisions that affect your life. So those decisions have consequences. So you're dreaming, and you dream, and you dream, and you dream some more. And every now and then, those consequences will come out, and you're thinking about them while you're sleeping. And then they'll come out with some kind of an outcome. And you wake up remembering that outcome. And it happens. Well, of course it happens. Out of all this information, every now and then you're going to get a hit. You're going to get a hit. So you can say, yeah, I dreamed the future. It was a future because it was put into your mind otherwise. For most of us anyway. Dreams have been very important in many cultures, including Babylon. They can be pleasant and they can be absolute nightmares. They're often equivalent to visions, meaning that they are the products of divine influence. This is common in both the Old and New Testament, particularly in Ezekiel and Daniel in the Old Testament. And if you look at, folks, the incidents like with the Magi and with Joseph in Matthew chapter 2, that's all there. Dreams are generally hard to remember, and some are, unfortunately, very difficult to forget. If you're dreaming, you cannot read. If you see a sign in a dream, you can't read it. Some people cannot remember their dreams at all. My mother claimed that she never remembered a single dream all her life. Sometimes I wish that I had her brain. But for those of us who do remember them, they are often troubling, and this is where Nebuchadnezzar was. Now, I'm going to tell you how to remember a dream. We got about just enough time to talk about that. This is how you remember a dream, because you might want to do this. When you wake up from a dream, lie still, relax. Gather up all the details you remember, just like you're putting them in a basket, and review them. Remain still while you're doing this. Do not move. And then when you do get up, write it down. And then you'll have it. And you know what you do next? You spend all day wondering what that dream meant. And then that night you're going to lay there staring at the ceiling all night long, wondering what that dream meant. I'm just warning you. Now, Nebuchadnezzar had insomnia. Have you had insomnia? Wake up in the middle of the night, usually from some insane dream. Walk the floor, often the rest of the night. Several nights in a row, it's a killer. And then the problem is that those dreams are really, really disturbing. You're afraid to go back to sleep because you don't know what's waiting for you when that curtain drops. Nebuchadnezzar was troubled by his dreams and he couldn't sleep. And he had one big one. Now, this is where we're going to stop because we've got about a minute left. So anyway, I appreciate it very much. Y'all let me come up here and do this. And as always, it's an honor to be here. Anybody got any questions, comments? If it's something easy, I'll answer it. If it's something wrong, if it's something that's not easy, I'll call security and have you removed. But okay, there we are. Thank you very much.